Christof, Rühl, your thoughts on the same subject? I mean, I might take a little issue with Mike there. We don't need to literally shut down the world economy like COVID in order to sort of define a black swan event, at least not in my black swan definition book. Missiles shooting across the Red Sea, they get close to kind of black swanny, but nonetheless, in either case, definition aside, oil markets are relatively undisturbed by events in 23, and they continue to be in 24. Is that the case? Your thoughts?
Well, this is one of these rare occasions where I have to side with Mike. There really was only one black swan event.
Where's my yellow card? Yellow card, yellow card.
He's right. There was only one, and that was the 7th of October, I think. All that before is a result of black swan events, if you want to, in 2022, and all that afterwards is the result of October 7th, including the Red Sea blockade. That's number one. Number two, what it shows us is that there is enough oil in the world. You know, this is where Mike and I have parted sides very often in the past. You know, but I do think what we are seeing is ample oil supplies, announced cuts of OPEC and OPEC Plus with big words and very little effect, because many of these oil supplies are coming from outside of OPEC. And in terms of your definition now, Sean, and if you talk about black swan events, what you want to call that, one of the reasons the oil price reacted very little is that when you have a sizable buffer of spare capacity, then geopolitical shocks or any kind of economic outside shocks are going to have, if they are positive, a much lower impact than if you have no spare capacity. And one of the things OPEC and OPEC Plus has given us over the year 2023 and 2022 is ample spare capacity. So in a way, it's starting to become very self-defeating. And when we talk about later about trends into 2024, I would go one step further and say that they are getting themselves on the brink of a decision where they would have to either, you know, stop creating that spare capacity or doing it in a much more powerful way in order not to prevent price spikes, but to keep from prices in the 70s.
Picking up on that, I mean, fundamentals, we ended the year in sense 23 with OPEC Plus, you know, having a difficult meeting, or a difficulty in arriving at a decision, a meeting that went on, that the fundamentals of the supply side are heavily weighted in a ability to cut. So it's hard to call those oil market fundamentals. Your thoughts on outlook?
Well, I would say two things. One, reaching into the back and connecting it to the future. I think 2023 was sort of the annus horribilis for oil analysts, energy analysts generally, but particularly oil analysts. A huge amount of humble pie actually should be eaten. You know, I remember at the beginning of the year when everybody predicted, not everybody, but a lot of people, $180 or $200 oil. And then China coming out of COVID would be the big jump, you know, overlooking the small fact that the Chinese consumers had not been stuffed with fiscal transfers during the lockdown, as was the case in Europe or the US. Then, you know, the US, the rig count goes down, horrible, overlooking completely the improved productivity per rig, you know, reading the whole shale story wrong, you know, as a story where the money now goes to investors and financial sectors, not as a story where productivity was streamlined and the Americans did in oil. And that's what they have done in so many other industries before. So I'm saying all of that not to put the blame on the people, although I thought it should be to some extent. It's amazing to me how people get away with impunity, but because it leads to a degree of caution about the forecast for 2024. Now everybody says, oh, too much oil and it's going to be pressure on the supply side. So one has to be very cautious on that. And what do we know about 2023? I agree again with Mike. We know that even more so, I would say that supplies are likely to exceed demand at the moment. So there would be downward pressure to start with. But then I would raise at least three other points which promise to throw maybe all of this aside again. One is what will happen most likely in the year 2024, even though it's not immediately connected to oil markets. There has to be an admission at COVID-29 or before of the International Panel for Climate Change that the Paris targets will be missed, full stop. And that will have repercussions on the whole discussion on energy transition, climate change, which will also affect the oil markets. It may be less of a topic, it may become more of a topic, it may be driven more by panic, may be driven more by people reluctantly engaging with this topic at all. But it's something which will have, it's in the numbers, it's there, we see it, and which hasn't been done.
There was a lot of talk about at COP28 just a few weeks ago here in Dubai about holding on to that 1.5 degree, more fantasy, more rhetoric than reality. And your point is well taken that it's time to acknowledge realities and adjust scenarios accordingly.
The second, yes, I think it will have a spillover into all market discussions. We don't know what nature. The second one is the whole debate on peak oil will gather speed, because again, it's in the numbers. I still believe that within that decade, we are likely to see peak oil demand, and that will change everything, just like the shale revolution has completely changed geopolitics and the global economy. This is American energy independence. Peak oil demand will mean a shrinking market. In a shrinking market, as I've said many times, the low-cost producer is king. In order to maintain the same amount of exports you have today in a shrinking market, you will have to, by definition, increase market share. This means price competition all over the place. How OPEC, and especially OPEC Plus, will hold up under these conditions, or whether they at some point say, okay, we have to let it go and bring prices really low to eliminate competition, is an open question. Whether it will come to a 4 in 2024, the year behind, we don't know. But it will come most likely in that decade, and it will change oil markets in a very, very substantial way, I think. And then the third event is again something, you know, in this triangle between economics, geopolitics, and global energy, it's rare that energy is in the driving seat and impacts the other two. It's more often the case that energy and oil is impacted by economics or by politics and wars and so on. We have one of these events with that potential in 2024, and that's the American election. In both respects, if it may create a lot more instability, including global confrontations, or it may usher in a period sort of more reconciliation and more return to America in a normal way, you know, stabilizing its leadership positions in the world. But it's going to be another watershed moment with very, at the moment, unclear consequences for oil markets. And what we do know is that we have these events and need to try to figure out from the beginning which way they will impact the markets we're interested in. And that's a little bit the task at the moment. And it's really hard to have a crystal ball, even with these known events. You know? And, you know, the famous black swan events we shouldn't discuss because by definition they are unknowable.
Christof, I wanted to get your thoughts on the end of the year 23. We saw the OPEC Plus meeting. You know, as we had a session earlier today that said OPEC meetings were lasting minutes and then ended the year lasting weeks. How does OPEC Plus look like to you going into 24? Is it the force it was? They lost Angola a few weeks ago. Where's their role in the market, you think, in 24?
I think they're in a very difficult position. I think a lot will depend whether they can sort of continue to muddle through, which would have the precondition that oil demand comes in anywhere close to what you just quoted with 1.7, 1.8 million. That's far from certain. I think I have something here in the way.
Yeah, there's a survey question about whether the black swans will the market will remain immune. I suppose the ultimate part of that question now, having discussed it, is what's your definition of a black swan? But
I think that the projected supply increases from outside OPEC Plus are large enough to cause problems for Saudi Arabia and Russia to enforce cuts, which would be larger, which is necessary in order to really sort of affect the balance between demand and supply. I think that more people will wake up to something which must be already discussed in the leading circles of OPEC Plus, which is what I mentioned earlier, the fact that demand is at some point going to peak, because right now we have this amazing phenomenon. All these guys are cutting and at the same time expanding production capacity, complaining there isn't enough demand, investment from one side, and then themselves increasing capacity hugely, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Russia, and cutting production in order to keep it up. That looks to me like a preparation already, you know, for some battles for market share. I think at the end of the day, depending, as I said, on the supply numbers from elsewhere and on global demand, if they come this year or next year, there will come a tight spot where Saudi Arabia would have to think about the early 80s and to ask itself the question, do we open the taps and teach others a lesson? Or is there a way of teaching them before just by using the threat or using arguments to join the cuts? If the cuts are not joined more broadly and carried out by mostly Russia and Saudi Arabia as currently, then this will be a dead-end road.
Just looking at widening the lens, our last few minutes together through the 24 outlook, it is a year full of major elections. You mentioned one in your earlier comment, the US in November, but of course we've Taiwan this month, we've got Pakistan next month, we've got Indonesia coming up. Will this remain the same? The market immune? Yes, but the European elections mid-year, members of European Parliament, even the British are likely to. Where do you think these other wider events, in parallel, that are very relevant to the wider energy markets? What do you see looking out that paying attention to?
I think we should not expect too much from Europe. It will continue to be an area. If you want to say slow growth, that would be true. If you wanted to say moderation in global politics, that would also be true. So however you phrase it, not very exciting, but probably rational and reasonable. It will not be able to completely shoulder the burden of supporting Ukraine against Russia, given the way in which Russia has transformed itself into a very effective war machine, including its economy.
Do you think we're in the end game of Russia-Ukraine?
No, not yet. I don't think so. I think that Mr. Putin is playing a long game. He's played it very well. And I do know from the economic side that Russia really has effectively transformed itself into a military wartime economy. And the domestic resistance is allowed to leave the country. So it's not very effective. And Ukraine is hanging on by a thread, but it's completely dependent on Western support. Europe will not be able to completely replace America in that Western support. And my fear is that it's for a long time now, it looks like, the Ukrainians get sort of enough to survive, but not enough to win. And that's not a very productive situation. It will not stop by Russia suddenly stopping it. But so I think that what we have in Asia is, like you said earlier, it's true that China is in a poor state. I was there, and it's not all bad because a lot of it is really driven by expectations. So a very gloomy outlook there, very gloomy feeling, a little bit like, the famous prisoner when the door opens after X years and he refuses to leave his cell because he can't imagine what's outside. That was the reaction to COVID to me, a little, how I would paraphrase it. And the economy also, the expectations much worse than from the outside. You say 5% growth is not bad, but for them, the decline from 8 to 5, it's almost borderline stagnation. These are things which are changeable, these expectations. China has one big Achilles heel, which relates to the people Mike met in Switzerland skiing, which is capital flight, which hasn't happened yet on a grand scale. But the government, whatever it does to fight the economic downturn, will have to keep controls in place of people just leaving, like they left Russia, and taking their money out. And that is a threat which explains a lot of the kind of restrictions we are seeing in Chinese politics, which will not go away. So in Asia overall, you will have I think that China will not decline any much further, but it's not clear to me that the others are ready to take over India and Indonesia in terms of global economic growth, and that's what matters for oil demand. And in the US, it looks pretty good. Never bet against the US on both fronts, with the shale front and also with the soft landing of the economy. So that at the beginning of 24 would indicate that you have strong growth in North America, a little bit of that reflected in South America, where Brazil is doing reasonably well with a lot of instability behind us. Hopefully Argentina probably being able to recover. So that would, in the wake of the American ship, be lifted up. Europe would sort of muddle through also together with the Americans. China will have another year of adjustment, but probably bottoming out, in the rest of Asia not quite able to take over. That would indicate slightly slower global growth in 23 and in 24 than in 23, and therefore a little bit of a decline in oil markets. Now, with oil demand, just one last word, we have to be careful. It's not about before and after COVID. Oil demand in the OECD has peaked in 2006, not in 2020, and has been declining systematically ever since. In Europe, You know, they have now 1/3 more cars than they had then, but in 79 it has peaked. And there's only India, China, and the Middle East itself which are growing in terms of demand, and that makes optimism on the demand side a dicey game.